Welcome to the third dialogue that JASS is hosting in the series of Women Radically Transforming a World in Crisis, thinking about rage, resistance, and transformation, but at the same time asking ourselves the important question of what does this movement moment mean for all of us organizers and movement builders? And for this dialogue, we have asked amazing activists who we hope will share with us and reflect on really what does it mean in South Africa when we see the rise in femicides, we see in Guatemala the affirmation of Blackness being undermined, we see in Germany continuous fascism and racism, in Brazil every 23 minutes, a Black person is killed. And of course, in the United States, that in the past month, we have seen so many mobilizations in the streets, and we want to ask questions about what really all of these dimensions and movement moments mean for all of us globally. So I'm so excited to introduce to you all comrades and friends who are joining me. Ruth joining us from Kenya. Mary joining us from the United States. Joanna joining us from Guatemala. Sheila joining us from Brazil. Magda joining us from Germany. You will find a link of the CVs of everyone on the panel. Please read a lot about the amazing work that the comrades and colleagues are continuing to do in their organizing work. Thank you so much, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to start our conversation by putting Mary on the spot, especially. Mary, to ask, in particular, my sister, what is fueling this rage? And what are the historical and genesis of this moment for you where you are located?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Phumi, for having me, and such a blessing to be with the other comrades from all over the globe. What a great way to start the morning. But I will say, what is fueling the rage? I think what we're seeing is years and generations of heartbreak, What we're seeing is, you know, when we see the incidents of police murder on Black lives, and we, you know, wake up today and Breonna Taylor, who was killed in Kentucky, her killers, the police, still not be acquitted, or excuse me, still not be arrested or charged or held accountable. What we know is that this is generations of heartbreak and disappointment of what it is meant to be a stolen people on stolen land by the U.S. empire, that continues to exploit us, that continues to show by the structure of this country, the culture of this country, that Black people to them are not valuable, when we know that that is a lie. And so I think what we are up against and what we continue to see at every tipping point like this is that the awakening, the consciousness is opening, and that it becomes more than just people not being, you know, people not being treated fairly by, you know, their white employer, what have you. All of those things are part of the rage. But when we see, you know, Black bodies being killed by police, with state sanction and being sanctioned by the state to do it, while we know COVID is happening, and so many of our people have been dying from COVID. Black people are the most impacted by COVID, and not have been able to get the economic security or the health care security that we need in order for people to survive this thing, and to make sure that folks aren't having to choose between paying rent or going to work where they could potentially contract COVID. And so all of this is a culmination of generational trauma and heartbreak, and also a reminder of our relationship to this country. As Sister Sada Shakur said, Black people in America, we are not citizens here. And that is what we're stewing in right now. And that is why we see, the uprisings happening the way we're seeing them right now.
Thanks, Mary. I'm wondering, Sheila, if you can relate to that, especially from the news we're getting from Brazil, a lot around the intersection of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy, and a government literally that is completely uncaring. How do you think about this moment, this rage in relation to the work of the coalition and how you are organizing in Brazil?
Hi, hello, good morning. Good morning for me. Good morning for all. Great to be here with you guys, girls especially, actually. I'm very glad to be able to do this dialogue with so amazing women around the world. Here in Brazil, I'm a lawyer from this coalition, Black Coalition for Rights, we call, translating, we call Black Coalition for Rights. It's a articulation between 150 Black movements and Black organizations working together to do political action here in Brazil. So I believe this what it put us together, because we are so different with so many different agendas, all anti-racist agendas, but in different segments. What put us together now is rage. It's a statement that we cannot be continuing be killing by police now, doing whatever you can do to put ourselves against the situation. Similar with United States and other countries that are living discussing about authoritative governments. We're living here in Brazil, so we have a president not he only not endorse police violence, police brutality, but he enforces, like he incentive this kind of violence. It's not us now that say that we are in a war. Our presidents say that they are in a war against our communities, and we have a lot of different sentence about him, sentence that he said, but one of that is most shocking to us, and when they press ask him about the deaths occurring today against Black communities, he say they want to kill us as cockroaches. And so this is how our president see our Black communities today, and he is speaking about this publicly. So imagine what he does without press coverage. We have this problem, as Pumi points, each 23 minutes a Black young man is killed by police here in Brazil. This situation, it's worse with the pandemic. Brazilian police never killed more than between those months, between February and April. A period supposedly we had to be isolate, and we are isolate. The people who can afford to be isolated, it's isolate, but most of the Black community cannot afford this because they are in jobs, they are in the line front of the essential services. So most of the Black community, it's on the streets, it's not in quarantine, and we have this situation that the police is killing more today than they ever did before. So yes, we are with a lot of rage, and we are having a lot of troubles to make our voices being heard in this moment, that we don't have Congress function as before, when we can have difficult to go across the streets and to mobilize our people couldn't, because our policy, it's not how can I put this? Our policy will use all the force they can do to not turn able to us to be on street reivindicating our rights. Our policy is too brutal to us to engage in massive riots right now.
Thank you, Sheila. I'm hoping that we will talk about the intersection of multiple forms of crisis that are playing out during this moment. But I wanna cross over to Joanna in Guatemala. Here we've just heard from Mary and from Sheila about quite visible big numbers of assertion, even in the moment of a president attempting to erase a whole peoples. I wonder if you could share with us how the rage and the anger that you are experiencing and organizing around is playing out in Guatemala as Black people are working to affirm their existence as we are all over. Joanna? Estás en mute.
Hola. Saludos a todas, es un gusto compartir.
Joanna says, hello everyone, it's a pleasure to share the screen with all of you. Thank you for the opportunity. I'll be the only one who will be speaking in Spanish, and I'm representing my region as I do that. One of the things that feeds this anger that we have and in this fight against anti-racism in Guatemala and in many other countries in the region, for a lot of people, too many people, reporting racism is seen as exaggerated. There's a very limited understanding of what racism is, and so it would seem that racism can only be experienced if there's a massacre or if direct murders. However, there is racial profiling, there is violence against Black bodies, and these kinds of prejudices are part of the police and private security and the justice system too. So in terms of violence and discrimination,
que son víctimas de estos hechos o desestiman los casos porque no parece tan grave.
People usually feel like they can't report cases of racism because they feel like they don't count or they won't be recognized, and that's a huge problem as well. The historical exclusion and structural racism that Afro-descendant communities in our country have suffered is something that we continue, a burden that we continue to carry in this time. One would think that with the abolition of slavery and the signing of the peace agreements, all of that would be in the past, but that's not true. In the social imaginary, in social interactions, and in the relationships of power, we are still considered like a savage people, or people who don't have the professional capabilities to occupy certain positions of power. And therefore, the pre-existing crisis of these communities who have been forgotten by the state have worsened when we see other intersections of crises such as the current pandemic. We see that there are more vulnerable groups of people.
Expuestos a la infección directa.
And not only because they're directly exposed to the virus, but because of their conditions in life in general that make them more vulnerable. And lastly, something that is also making us very angry is the stigmatization that hypersexualizes Black bodies, specifically women and young Afro-descendant women.
Sobre la disposición al
and there are
trabajo.
certain prejudices about Black women's bodies, sex work, exploitation, and unwanted activities that are associated with Blackness. And that makes us very angry because in the 21st century, we see that the social imaginary
Magda, organizing with the Black Initiative in Germany. Sure, you found some similarities too, but we saw so many of you taking to the streets as well to continue the struggles of many years ago. But what is it about this moment, about the rage and the resistance that took you to the streets in the past few weeks? And how do you relate that to the history and genesis?
Firstly, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I'm so excited and already so inspired by the sisters who were just speaking. I would say that the fact that in the midst of a global pandemic where we have been approached by several states to stay at home to save our lives, Black people are still being killed, be it in the US or in countries like Germany, is really fueling the rage in terms of realizing that we as Black people, I would say globally, transnationally, have to go outside to save our lives. We have to protest to save our lives. And I would say what is very special about this moment right now is that it's especially young people who are organizing. When we look at the protests and the actions in Germany, for example, in Frankfurt, in the city where I'm located, it's mainly being organizing by young people, very young people between the ages of 19 and 22, who are very, first and new into terms of organizing and activism, and have very sharp minds, are very radical when it also comes into questions of which Black lives are we talking? Is it just Black men, or is it also regarding the intersections of queerphobia in our own communities? And I would say that this moment is me and us giving like a lot of hope, and also a lot of excitement, like also questioning, maybe raising one question: what can we use? What can we do out of this moment we are living in? And also not just in my location in Germany, but also maybe in a whole global scale, which is addressing many Black people and many Black movements who have been existing for centuries and decades. And police violence is in Germany obviously also a huge issue. So I can totally relate to Joanna, what you just said about the Black experience in Guatemala, where maybe racism is not being really fully grasped or understood in the public discourse. And I would definitely say that we have the similar problems in Germany, where we still have to discuss publicly, be it in the parliament or in the media, what racism actually means and how far Black people experience racism. So we are on a discourse or discussion level very below, I would say, levels of maybe other countries like the US. And what's very interesting also from an organizing view is that many Black-led organizations are getting so many media requests at the moment in Germany and being like, oh, getting calls like, tell me, how do you experience racism in Germany? At the same time, we are already over this question. We don't want to, we don't need to explain ourselves. We don't need to explain our existence, but at the same time, the country is making us to do so. So also like what I'm thinking about is also the question of and how far those all requests we are getting are kind of hindering us from actually moving forward and getting out on the street and organizing ourselves.
Thank you so much, Magda. It leads me nicely to Ruth. Failed liberation, Ruth. Failed African liberation, post-colonial issues, where do we find ourselves? It was quite shocking to see the police violence in Kenya and what is happening in the Kiguma refugee camp, in what Magda reminds us of whose life matters, you know? Are we wiping off trans people, Black people? What is it? Failed liberation?
I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about when Magda was speaking about is the fact that in this country, like most countries across this continent and across the world, and also going back to the history of the formation of the police, is that areas. And it's incredible to see how the state uses the poor and working class to discipline and oppress the poor and the working class. So it's important to, when we think about police violence, to actually think not just in terms of the class nature of those who get disciplined and those who get oppressed and those who get condemned to basically a non-life, but to actually think through how those who are already condemned to basically living horrible and pathetic lives are recruited by the state to be purveyors of violence. I mean, it's important to think through whose Black life matters. And I think especially for Black feminists across the world, it's been something that's been very, very important, in as much as we know very clearly that Black men sit on a very particular intersections of the kind of police brutality or state violence against them. But we do know that we live in a society where to be trans, to be queer, to be a woman, to be non-binary, gender conforming, attracts even more levels of violence because of the intersections that we sit in. You know, they're related to our gendered expressions, our sexuality, and our class. And these are absolutely important to think about. So we cannot think about police violence. We cannot think about the military violence or the state violence. And state violence in multiple ways, not just having the police beating or killing, but actually the violence of not having education, the violence of failed health systems, the violence of failed educational systems, the violence of not being able to put food on the table because of legacies of colonial, you know, we're living through the afterlives of colonial violence, where people still don't have access to land. You know, major landowners, whether local elites or foreign elites, still own the land. I know, Pumi, you're from South Africa. You could speak about this for the next 30 days without stopping about the politics of colonization and land. So it's important to link all these particular intersections together. And rightly, as you've spoken about Kakuma, a few years ago, in this particular country, we unfortunately, because of the intersection of Islamophobia and how, for example, Somalis have always been treated in very problematic ways by the state, we had Somalis rounded up and put in something that we now consider, or we call sort of a concentration camp. But we've seen that the fact that to be African in a very weird sense is to be legal, even on this continent. You know, that anti-Blackness, you know, isn't just something that happens in the African diaspora, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the Caribbean, whether it's in Latin America, but even on this particular continent. You know, if you're a refugee, if you're undocumented, you still experience levels of violence that are so problematic when you think about the anti-colonial struggles and the hopes and visions that we had when we were trying to liberate this particular continent. So you're right, Pumi, we have to make these connections. It's not just one thing. We have to make different connections. We also have to look at how different bodies are placed, how they emerge within a particular system. So it's important to make those particular links in this particular moment, and to think through what are politics of actual radical liberation, not a masculinist liberation, not a pro-capitalist liberation, not you know, a Western, you know, Western-centric liberation looks like for those of us on this continent.
Thanks, Ruth. Interesting, comrades, like 400 years on, right? And we are thinking about how to dismantle these structures of oppression 400 years on, this is where we are. But where's the light bulb? You know, when we think about transforming power, when we think about rechanneling these energies, what are the things that we are beginning to see? Sheila.
Hello, are you listening? Yeah. Yes, hearing about those experience and those situations, I believe we had a lot of in common, like the lack of reparation about slavery and historical process to who brings us here today to discuss this and the violence Black bodies suffer every day. In this intersectionality perspective I am here in Brazil, and I don't know you guys have this experience in other countries, but here in Brazil we have a movement led by mothers, and rage is what moved them. I think it's very interesting to see how they fight in 4 pillars like memory, justice, truth, and liberty, because Mothers of May, it's this movement led by women who has their sons killed by police brutality, and they fight. Their struggle is not only a measure of reparation, but their struggle is for justice. It's for memory. It's for the real. It's the truth that we not always know what happened with those children, with this men, with this young people that were killed. And this moment is for liberty, because how they put is that we will never be free. We will never be free, totally free, as long as our lives, our community, our people are being slashed, are being killed in this format. So I was thinking a little bit about that, because it's very difficult to connect this struggle in a woman perspective, because when we are talking about police violence, it's mostly against men and against young boys, and they're killed by police. But I think it's important for us to see how these issues affect women. Here in Brazil, women are more incarcerated related to drug issues. So the experience of violence, it's related to an incarcerament, a mass incarcerament. Our experience of violence is related to our sons, our brothers, our husbands that never come home. And I'm thinking about the human, there are victims of other kind of violence, and we don't even talk about this, like rapes and violence against our bodies and violence against our integrity. They're torture about torture by policy, and how has this statement that we out of our places. So the violence we suffers just to be on the streets, just to be at the public space, reivindicating our rights. Pumi, I think I didn't answer exactly your question, because I lost the last part because about the connection. But I was thinking about these issues relate to how women are so important when we're talking about this struggle against violence for our Black communities. And I was thinking the role the mothers have, the mothers leads, because how they always say is a part of me that with my boys, a part of me that with my sons that I lost for this system. So they only continue living because of the struggles they carry on. So it's very it's also, it's a pretty movement, but it's a movement so touching, because when they do this, when they put together other mothers that suffers the same violence, they relive the experience of violence. So I think it's a constant reminder of the suffering they had in history, and when they put themselves in this struggle, these struggles, institutional, on the streets, on the political space, they live this pain every day. So I was thinking about then when our comrades were talking about the realities in their countries.
No, completely. Thanks, Sheila. You see, on this question of like how we transform power, you remind me, Mary, of also conversations we've had about, you know, the work that you've done with women who are incarcerated. You know, there's the police in the streets and so on, and many of us, well known, I think, run to the police to save us. Criminal justice system, there's a rape, I'm gonna go to the police and report. There's this as like a way of finding justice. Could you share, Mary, like making links with what Sheila is saying and about these wonderful 4 pillars that the mothers are doing, to link it not only with the police work, but also with, you know, the freeing of mothers, and especially centering women as like the centers of care. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think that there's, you know, I think that there's some amazing synergy happening right now as it relates to the way in which folks who embody and carry the feminine divine, as I like to put it, the feminine divine, and what the opportunities in terms of not just the ideology, many move with a Black queer feminist politic, but we also know what does that look like in practice, creates the opening of where and how we can transform and shift power. And so you brought up the work that we've been doing around the Black Mama's Day bailout as a way for us to, one, be reminded ancestrally of what we have done to free ourselves, and that what it means for us to collectivize our resources, no matter how meager, to be able to free ourselves and to be able to put that that level of self-determination and power back into our communities, and not have to wait until, you know, some lawyer or the criminal justice system says you're free to go. And I think that what has been made possible with doing that work is that there has been models that we've been practicing of how we get folks stabilized who have been incarcerated, and making sure that we not only just get our people out, but we're also able to take care of one another. Because part of us not being able to rely on the state is being able to have the self-determination to take care of our own people, which boils down to how we govern ourselves. And I think that many of the comrades and folk who are doing this work right now, I think we're also seeing a lot of openings when we think about, you know, what is possible, you know, here as we're talking about like defunding the police, for example. And one of the council elected officials said, well, there's so many people afraid. People in my district are afraid. And I think what part of what I'm excited to hear around the Mothers of May and the pillar around memory, because that is so important for Black people across the diaspora to remember the ways in which we have taken care of ourselves outside of the state, the way in which we have addressed community harm outside of the state, and be able to name the places where we didn't always get it right, particularly as it relates to patriarchal violence and gender-based violence. Those are some things that I think are still a growing edge. But in this moment, as we're saying, we don't want the police to be the first responders to issues in our communities. What that also is saying, it's a spiritual invitation for us to be able to say, then what am I going to do to become sanctuary for my neighbor, for my brother, for my sister, and making sure that that's inclusive of all Black lives. And unfortunately, a few weeks ago, there was a video put out of a beautiful Black trans woman named Ayana Dior, who was beat down by Black men in a convenience store in Minneapolis. And we were fuming, and not because we're shocked and surprised, but I think because I think it gives us a measure of how far we have to go in terms of the work that we have to do in order to dismantle patriarchal violence and really, you know, get to the heart of those matters. And so I think that there's much to be done as it relates to the memory of our people. Because if we can remember who we are and to whom we belong, and to our relationship to this country, our connections to one another, our people, you know, all across the waters, I think that that's where the opening to reclaim our power and to be able to transform the systems that we engage in with each other, right? The intercommunal systems we engage in with each other. And that's where I believe the Black Panther Party talked about the need to organize in a, and I might say the word wrong, prefigurative manner, where we must organize that shows what is possible, that we actually embody the vision of the world we're trying to create. And so that looks like programs down in Jackson, Mississippi, with the people's mercy, I forget the name of the program. I'll put it in the chat.
It will come to you.
But that's the possibilities.
Yuris, we have to ask of ourselves so many questions. And here we, you know, also to think about how we make these connections. There are many questions that have been asked before even the dialogue started. So before we continue our conversation, I'd like to invite Shireen Essoff, who is the ED of JASS, and Daisy Flores, who is the Communications Director from Mesoamerica, to share with us some of the questions that all of you are asking on Zoom and on Facebook. Shireen?
Thanks, Pumi, and thanks to everybody for being, you know, engaged in this conversation up until this point. Just to share, we have about over 200 people across 3 platforms that are, you know, participating, listening into the dialogue, asking questions. We have a range of different questions over the last number of days and today that are essentially just to give, you know, you, Pumi, and the panelists a sense, everything from, you know, the meaning of transformation and how it is that rage in both a positive and negative way, you know, fuel the energies for transformation, to centering, you know, the voices and experiences of Black women and their knowledge and expertise, to thinking about solidarities and, you know, how it is that we connect, including visions. You know, so what is this vision that we are, you know, wanting to live into? How do we organize and resist current systems in order to move into it? And what are some of the strategies and tactics that we can possibly activate, employ, remember from past struggles and our histories that have relevance for today, including issues of how we organize. I want to, however, lift up a set of things around, you know, this is a movement moment, and there's a set of questions that accrue around what for you panelists are the key things that we need to be thinking about doing across issues, identities, movements, borders, to ensure that we really use this moment as a tipping point that sort of rewrites the script. That means that we never go back to those 400 years ago that you spoke about, Pumi, or the 1800s, or, you know, the 1980s as markers of liberation. So there's a set of questions that really accrue around that. And then there's another set of questions that I think accrue around, Mary, what you just spoke about, and I think triggered some questions in the chat about the practical ways in which you, your formations and movements are caring, both for yourselves and each other, outside of the state, so that we continue to stay strong in the broadest sense of the word, and take care of each other in ways that really put care at the center. There's a specific question to Sheila about the meaning of the death of Cleonice Gonzalez in Brazil, and the meaning of her death for movements around the world as well. So I'll leave that with you, Pumi, and hand over to Daisy, and you can see how it is that you can work with some of those questions.
Gracias, Shireen, y gracias a todas las que nos están.
Daisy says, thank you, Shireen, and thank you to everyone who is listening. As Shireen said, there's more than 200 people who are listening and participating in this dialogue, and it's a true pleasure to be able to share these kinds of questions with everyone. In the Spanish section, we've also received a lot of questions regarding how we address within the feminist movement the issue of racism, how it can be confronted, and any tips for fighting against racism within our movements. It's something that's important for us to have in mind. And secondly, how can we express solidarity with anti-racist movements? And there's a specific question that has to do with violence experienced by Black people from the police. And it's a question from Guatemala. If you think that police brutality against Black people is part of police training,
Antes, o es parte de una expresión del racismo.
Is it only an expression of racism, of the racism of the police? And that's everything for us. Greetings to everyone again, and we'll continue with the conversation.
And thanks everyone who is continuing to share questions and comments in the chat box, both on Zoom and on Facebook. Thank you so much. Comrades, sisters, there were specific questions, but a lot of the questions really are talking about our movement work, the possibilities, and really how do we build and strengthen on what is possible? What do we have to undo? What do we have to defend and fight for what we have already? And what do we have to build? So before we even engage on those questions, whilst you're thinking about them, Sheila, there was a specific question about the murder of Gladys Gonzalez, which is the same, I think, in the way in which we've seen about Brie, about women, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to answer this question because I feel like many of us can relate around the murder of Clarín. Sheila.
Yes, I think it's very important and significant for Black movement to discuss this death and how we can put our struggle more relate with them. So thank you, Shireen, for these questions. I believe for our Black movement, it's significant that, and we debate about this and give us strength to our struggle. But unfortunately, here in Brazil, it's not a very just debate in the public arena. So it's very is very important for our Black movement. So, but in the public debate, it doesn't have the same strands that they have, and in the Black movement, they are organized. You all know the Black community in Brazil. We are more than half the Brazilian population. They are considered Black, but the Black movement, it's not so expanded and has the Black organized movements not so expanding our society. So we do this fight every day to have this recognition. Most of you must heard about this racial democracy myth that we lead in Brazil for many decades. So that Brazil being this misogynized country, so we don't have a problem about races. We don't have to discuss racial issues. This is the lead for most the decades after the abolishment process. So we have a legal abolishment, but we don't have a real abolishment. This is why we talk about 132 years of unconclusive abolishment, and I think we have to work I think we have a lot of work to do about this memory issues that Mary put so well. How important it is to discuss this with our diaspora, and how important discuss memory to bring together what our people lived 400 years ago, and how it's important for us to discuss this now, and how this still impacts our society, and how this is why we have so little representative and public space, and how we have so little represent and the power, economic power, and other forces that lead our society today. We have other death that you probably hear about. There is Marielle Franco. There was a congresswoman here in Brazil who was killed about probably about the paramilitary power that we have here in Rio de Janeiro. So this death it's one of the symbols that lead our Black movement here in Brazil today. And it's a woman who was a Congress, who was a lesbian, who was a woman comes from the favelas here in Brazil. So Marielle Franco represents a lot what we have to struggle against it.
Yeah. It quite moved us all over the world. Thanks, Sheila, for that. And I hope that you share resources about Tlanis right now for everyone to get more details about her murder. But I want to move to Joanna, where there is no violence, no murder, no body, but yet such deep racism exists. And at the same time, like the solidarities in a place in which, you know, is founded on the Mayan soil, what it means for you to think about the possibility for movement work at this moment.
Creo que significa desafíos, pero también
I think it
oportunidades.
represents challenges and also opportunities, because in a national context, we are facing the invisibility of Blackness and that historical presence, and what it has contributed to the community and the development of the country. I also see it as an invitation to connect internationally all those different struggles and how to connect with history in different regions in order to have a better understanding of how to mobilize ourselves and keep moving forward, because we know that structural racism has existed for more than 500 years for the Afro-descendant community, at least in Central America. And we have more than 200 years in our region, that kind of colonialism. So the stigmatization of Blackness is something that we have to transform in the social imaginary. And how to support the role of women in all of these stages, and how to rebuild that history from the perspective of women. In general, the Afro-descendant communities are marginalized, but women in these communities are marginalized even more. Their perspective is denied, is undervalued in all aspects of development. But also, in Guatemala,
reciente, pero tampoco tan antiguo del conflicto armado interno que se
The internal armed conflict that lasted 36 years has also played a significant role. And in the social imaginary, it would seem that because Afro-descendant communities are located where there wasn't a direct violence, they think that it didn't affect Afro communities. However, this led to more exclusion, more isolation, and more forced displacement of Black population from Guatemala that migrated to the U.S. There's this strong Garifuna representation in New York and in other parts of the U.S. And the internal displacement meant that we had to reorganize and for example, the traditional location of these Black communities in the North Atlantic is not even the majority of the population because there have been a lot of arrival from my indigenous group. So that has completely changed the power dynamics at a local level. They don't have majority, they have less opportunities for representation, less opportunities to be heard.
Y con una mirada no solo de división
do with geographical representation, but with social representation and with identity. And we see how this institutionalization that came after the peace agreements that tried to reduce gaps and overcome issues of racism and exclusion, we haven't even reached those objectives. And 30 years have already passed, and that institutionality has threatened more and more and weakened more and more. For example, there's currently the Secretary of Peace, but it doesn't have enough resources. There's the Indigenous Fund that doesn't have representation of Black or Garifuna or Afro-descendant people, or, for example, on the Commission Against Racism. And
se eliminó la Secretaría Presidencial de la Mujer.
The Secretary for Women was eliminated based on the argument that it was illegally created. However, in order to create a ministry,
que sabemos que en rango jerárquico ese es
we know that this took us back. And this Secretary for Women was the one that was responsible for implementing and promoting politics and policies for women.
Que se estuvo desarrollando por más de 10 años y que el año
They
pasado
were also responsible for representing Black communities in the country. And now we don't have an institution to support that kind of work. So those kinds of examples express the vulnerability that we have and how little the system cares about us. And also in terms of disaggregated data based on identity or ethnicity, we're far behind in terms of social indicators. Based on the census that was carried out in 2017 for the first time, we now have disaggregated data of the Afro-descendant community because through advocacy, we were able to register different options for people to self-identify. So Garifuna was not the only option, which was previously the case. Now we also have a new category for self-identification so that Afro-descendant communities can express their own identity. However, the rest of the institutions think of only 4 communities, Xinca, Garifuna, Maya, and Mestiza. The rest of us who don't have formal or official recognition are not able to have that access. So there's a lot that could be said.
Raises these unresolved issues we have, because on one level we're talking about building our institutions. At the same time, we want to rely on institutions, democratic institutions created that really don't serve us, right? Here's something to keep thinking about as we continue on the Q&A. And I want to go to Magda. The unresolved feminist issues, one of them being racism, and especially where you are located as a daughter of refugees in Germany, and organizing within the feminist movement as well. What are your reflections on that? And what can we learn from that work?
First of all, I would like to just share some thoughts I had while listening to Brianna again, and realizing how interesting it is to hear from so many different locations perspectives on the situation of Black lives, and coming to from the German context where, as you already mentioned, I'm a daughter of refugees. I grew up in Germany, I was born here, but would maybe not identify like some other Black people in Germany as a German or Afro-German. And I would say that the potential of rising up and of organizing in Germany also lies in the fact that this is diverse, many Blackness of Black people in this country, which has been already existing for centuries, even before German colonialism, even before the German colonial project started. So me being part, for example, of the Initiative of Black People, which has been founded over 30 years ago, also makes me realize that we as certain Black communities in Germany cannot talk about one community. There's no one Black community in Germany. And I think that's also very important to note, since I would say that it's slightly different even to certain other European countries, where we have, for example, the majority of Black people sharing the same histories with colonialism and empire, while in Germany we have Black people from multiple different locations which don't necessarily have this historical experience with German colonialism, but with other empires. And I would say, as Black communities in Germany, the potential is to listen more to each other, and also to recognize that, for example, especially the situation of Black refugees, and I think you, Ruth, just before you mentioned it so well and described the situation also of African refugees on African soil, which is not even different than the situation we have with Black refugees in Europe. So I think it's also important to note maybe that when we talk about Black movements in European countries, it's not just about Black movements of people who hold the German passport, for example, but especially when it comes to grassroots organizing, it's Black refugees who are, of course, more visible also when it comes to policing and to police violence. When I encounter racial profiling, it will be a completely different experience than when a Black sister who has not a German passport and who's being illegalized in this country is experiencing police violence. So I think the nemesis and the questions we as Black communities have to raise is also critiquing, having like a foundational critique of the state, of the German state, and criticizing state politics in general, and also criticizing the situation in which Black refugees are, especially in Germany, who are being silenced by communities, by migrant communities, because when we talk about refugees in Germany, we don't see Black refugees. Black refugees are being made invisible, and also being made invisible by our own communities, by Black communities ourselves. So I think it's also very important to note that and Angela Davis also said it when she visited Berlin 5 years ago, that the movement of the 21st century is actually the refugees movement. And I think we can also watch it globally, how it's being put into formation, especially by Black refugees, be it in Europe or even on the African continent. And Pumi, the question you just raised, which also came from the Q&A, and how far maybe feminist movements, which are maybe white-centered, can be pushing forward into anti-racist practices. I would say the first thing is to giving up space for marginalized women, giving up space, especially for Black women, when it comes to the situation in Germany, where we are still being even one of the racialized communities which are still being more invisible than maybe other non-white communities are. And I would say that the importance is, especially at this moment, to articulate anti-Black violence and anti-Blackness as an explicit form of racism, and not putting us under an umbrella term with many other migrant communities and racialized communities which are living in Europe and having also different histories than the history of Black people in Europe or in Germany. And also to Joanna, what you just said was also very interesting for me when it comes to data, because Germany has a very as you know, a very difficult history when it comes to data and counting people because of what happened during the Holocaust, during the Second World War. So one of the fights Black people have been fighting for over a decade is to finally also introduce data and kind of a census, a survey, which Black people in Germany can finally fill, so that we finally even know, we just have estimations. We don't even know how many Black people are actually living in Germany, because this data is not being asked. So we are getting asked if we have a migration background or not, which is also a very narrow term, but we don't know how many Black people live in this country. So we find, like, many Black people finally introduced a survey which will be public next week. So it's a very historical moment for us in Germany at the moment. It's a survey which has been worked on for over 5 years. It's called Afrocensus, which will be introduced in 3 languages: French, English, and German. And we just hope that through this journey of finally having a survey, we will have more numbers and also can put more pressure into our authorities and governments.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Magda, for those reflections. Ruth, I want to ask you about our responsibilities as people based on the continent when we think about the multiple forms of violence that ravage the continent. What's our movement responsibility in this moment and to making the connections?
I think, to begin with, I love one particular quote around that basically states that Jackie Alexander, the Black feminist from the US, says that we have to become fluent in each other's histories. This fluency in each other's histories allows us to not make assumptions of the particular histories of oppression or the context that different people across the continent that we live in actually experience. And often the histories of oppression or histories of resistance or histories of movements are often read in contention with one another, you know, often, especially when it comes to multi-generational or intergenerational histories of context and space and agency, are often read in very conflicting terms, you know. So to begin with, I think it's important for us to actually understand each other's histories in very nuanced ways. The second thing for me, I really love what Marcus said in terms of, like, Black people are not a monolith wherever they are. Even in my own country, Kenya, or even just the city that I live in Nairobi, you know, we're not this block, you know, undifferentiated block, undifferentiated mass, you know. It's important for us to actually ask ourselves what kind of utopian visions do we actually aspire to? That's actually very important for us when we think through what our responsibilities are, you know. It means then that we have to abandon the idea, and this is something that feminists have always really championed and really thought of, the idea that all of us are oppressed in the same particular way, or that because we are women, or we are queer, or we are trans, or we are, you know, whatever identities that we occupy or that we are, that it necessarily means that we have progressive or radical politics. You know, blackness is not a synonym for radical politics. We know very many Black people, very many Africans with absolutely regressive politics that I do not want to organize with. In fact, it's probably my lifelong struggle to basically ensure that I dismantle or work in movements to dismantle those ideas. So it's important for us to speak particular truths in terms of the utopian visions, and to be very clear what kind of utopian visions that we want to have. My responsibility as Ruth, for example, as an ecofeminist, as someone working on the intersections of ecological justice, is a radical idea around the politics of land that, you know, are commons, the idea of the commons, for example. You know, as someone who's queer, it's actually a radical idea of the fact that we have to abandon the idea that nuclear families or heterosexual families and relationships are the grand idea of how we move or we care for one another. This is a politics of tenderness and care, you know. So basically we have to think through what are our minimum non-negotiables, what are our histories around the kinds of oppression and movements and successes and possibilities and pitfalls that we've experienced across this vast continent, you know. I mean, and one of the things, for example, when I think about, when I think about Africa, you know, because of the lines of colonization, that even in terms of language, you know, we often know, those of us who are from formerly British colonies, know very little about French West Africa or Lusophone Africa, just even because of the politics of language. So much is obscured, so much is hidden, even in terms of understanding what is happening across different regions of the continent. And that is just in terms of region. Let's not even come down to what happens within our own countries, where we don't seem to be able to speak to each other even when we speak the same language, because politically, and the wounds that we carry from the past, colonial histories, you know, the kinds of democracies, or I don't even know what, they're not democracies, the kind of dictatorships and violence that we've experienced have made us, you know, move into a politics of unhumaning each other, that we don't see each other as comrades, as brothers and sisters, as you know, as people who have a stake on this continent, as a politics of liberation. So I think that's absolutely important. But finally, I say that our responsibility, once we've basically gone through this particular nuances, we have to think through something that Benedict Anderson, and something that has been really elaborated by very many, I'd say for someone who works or has been in community with farmers, is to think about a politics of imagined communities. You know, what is community to us, you know? And that allows us to move from this very reductionist ideas of possibilities of organizing to actually thinking about potential alliances across divisive boundaries. That's absolutely important, to think about imagined communities.
The key is, thank you so much, Ruth. The key is always thinking in the movement logic, right? The movement logic. And Mary, with rage, resistance, and transformation, and you comrades speak a lot about finding joy at the same time as we're holding this nightmare that is patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism. You talk about we must find joy. Now, Comrade Mary, I'd like you to speak 1 minute about that and lead us in song as we sign out.
All righty. Well, you know, I think it is, there is a word that ancestors gave me a while ago, and I often say it, and many people have heard me say it. And it's, I talk about in the context of the mandate. And the mandate for Black people in this time is to avenge the suffering of our ancestors, to earn the respect of future generations, and to be willing to be transformed in the service of the work. And I want to situate your question in that first part of what it means to avenge the suffering. Many people ask, and I think it has It can play out in multiple ways, but I think part of the avenging of the suffering, because we know generational trauma, also, it happens, right? And it is passed down, but we can also pass down Black love, Black joy, and Black healing. And so I think part of how we do the work is just as important in terms of the work we're doing. If we're angry and we're bitter, that's not sustainable. We're not gonna last. It gotta be fun. It gotta be sexy. It gotta be hot. You know what I mean? All of those things help us, as Audre Lorde talks about the use of the erotic and the ways in which longing and desire play a huge role in the ways in which we show up and stay in movement and build the world we wanna see. Yes, we gotta get that Black joy, y'all. This went too fast. And I'm gonna leave.
Never enough time, comrade. Never enough time. Please leave us a song.
I will lead us a song by Nalini Stamp here in the U.S., Beautiful Comrade. And it goes, why are we in this situation that brings us down? Can't you see we are losing patience with oppression now? The people will rise, the people will rise, the people will rise. The people will rise, the people will rise, the people will rise. Thank you.
Viva, comrade, viva. Thank you so much, everybody. Time is never enough, but thank you so much, Joanna Waterborn, Sheila de Cavallo, Ruth Nyambura, Magda Isaac, and Mary Hooks. Thank you so much for spending the last 1.5 hours with us, whether via the 3 Facebook platforms and here on Zoom. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next JASS Dialogues, where we think about how we as feminists can radically transform this world that is in crisis. Thank you and good night.
Black people will be free in America, Black people will be free in Tanzania, Africa, and everywhere else.
Long live the freedom of George Floyd, long live! Long live!
This is a message of solidarity coming out of Cape Town, South Africa.
We will keep fighting. We will keep standing together. Family, we love you. See you.
We see you. We join you. Alita continua.
Ma-Afrika amahle, siyanithanda, ralerata. Freedom, uhuru, now. Defend Black lives. Defund the police. Izwe lethu, i-Afrika, inkululeko ngoku.
Comrades and family in the movement for Black lives in the US, comrades in Brazil organizing under the Coalition for Rights, comrades across the Americas and across Africa and Europe, we continue to stand with you in this time of struggle, in this time of the devaluing of our lives, but to elevate our voices in unity to say we are together, we will build this global movement, and we will continue to rise, and we will continue to win.